What makes you the person you are? Is it your body, your whole body, or just a smaller part of it, like your brain? Or maybe it is the beliefs you hold and your memories. How much of this biological or mental part of you needs to be preserved in order that you remain the same person? In other words, what part of you needs to be preserved that you may survive death? I'm Dr. Ernest Valea, and in this episode we discuss such issues in an attempt to define the self, the core of our being, that provides our personal identity. But first we start, as usually, with the sign of the cross. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. The content of this episode is a summary of Chapter 2 of this book on personal identity. The most common way to identify a person is by the look of his or her body. For this reason, we have in our passport or other form of ID a picture of a smaller part of our body, which is our face. The appearance of our face significantly differentiates us from other people. But on what ground can one affirm that I am the same person I was 25 years ago, since my face has changed significantly? This is how I looked in my old passport 25 years ago. Since it is me, despite some minor alterations, it seems that we do not require a rigid identity of the kind required for my keys. My keys must keep the same shape and size, or else I'll be locked out of my house. If we require this kind of identity, we will hardly find anything truly unchanged, given that our body, beliefs, and memory are constantly changing. Since we are the same person over time, despite all changes, we need to define a transitive kind of identity. Other good identification points are the fingerprints or the iris of the eye. These do not change and are easily recognizable by scanning devices. But even if I were to lose these physical marks, I would not cease to be the same person. If one loses his hands in a tragic accident and has no fingerprints, or loses his eyes and has no irises, we still affirm that she or he is the same person. What was lost is not personal identity itself, but rather some means of identification. We do not doubt that with the amputation of a limb, the surgical removal of a kidney, or even a heart transplant, the identity of a person remains unchanged. However, we do have one organ which, if it were transplanted, we are not so sure would leave us the person we are. This is the brain, the organ which physicalists consider to be the seat of consciousness, on the assumption that one's mental life is preserved by the particular associations between the billions of neurons in the brain. This means that at least the brain must be preserved in order to remain the same person. The brain criterion for establishing personal identity is illustrated by a thought experiment imagined by Sidney Shoemaker in the 60s, in which he speculated on the psychological outcome of a brain transplant. Imagine that medical science has evolved enough that brain tumors are operated on outside the skull. Two patients, Brown and Robinson, are operated on in this way, But by error, their brains are switched and put back in the wrong skulls. The recipient of Robinson's brain dies, while Robinson survives with Brown's brain. The question is, who will wake up from anesthesia, Brown or Robinson? On the assumption that the brain carries one's mental life, we should believe that Brown will awaken in Robinson's body. He would remember episodes of Brown's life very vividly and very convincingly for Brown's wife, while nothing of Robinson's life. Such grotesque science experiments are unlikely to become reality, but they are useful to reveal our assumptions and what we actually believe on personal identity. Believing that the element that sustains consciousness is our brain, followers of the physicalist view attempt to preserve the body of a deceased person by cryonics, that is, by freezing the body with its brain in liquid nitrogen, or at least one's head. They intend to bring it back to life when medicine has evolved sufficiently to cure the particular disease that led to the death of that person. However, many scientists are skeptical about this method, fearing that freezing in such conditions does irreversible damage to the brain. One particular case of the brain criterion for preserving personal identity is the idea that just one hemisphere of the brain would be enough. This idea originates in studies on the effects of commissurotomy, that is, the sectioning of the part that connects the two hemispheres. This scenario, given by the possibility of transplanting both hemispheres, thus resulting in two people who retain the identity of the original person, already suggests that something is wrong with the physicalist approach to personal identity. As a result, philosophical speculation went on to define personal identity in psychological terms. Bernard Williams demonstrated the weakness of the brain criterion by using the following thought experiment. Starting from the Brown-Robinson case, suppose that all the mental content in Brown's brain is downloaded to a hard disk for safekeeping during brain surgery, and afterwards it is uploaded to the same brain. If the mental content could be downloaded from one brain to such a storage facility and then uploaded back to the same brain, personal identity should be preserved. But if the upload were done to another brain, for example to Robinson's, we would reach the same result and conclusion as in Shoemaker's original scenario, that Brown awakens in Robinson's body. In this case, however, the actual brain transplant was no longer needed to preserve Brown's identity. The upload of his mental content as mere information would be sufficient to get the same result. Therefore, it would no longer be necessary to preserve a biological component, a complete brain or a part of it for preserving personal identity. In the end, what counts for survival is just information. What is necessary for the preservation of personal identity would then only be the mental content, the sum of the beliefs, memories, and character traits of that person. Before continuing on these lines, we should be aware of the computational assumption behind this scenario. That is, that the preservation of consciousness does not depend on the presence of the brain, for it is just some software that can run on other hardware on another brain, in this case. The same idea that one's identity can be kept as information is at work in the assumption that consciousness is somehow encoded in the billions of neural connections in the cortex. So by replicating the brain, molecule by molecule and neuron by neuron, and all their connections, one can also replicate the mental content of a human being. Remember from the Star Trek series, which started in the 60s, the idea of transporting people into cosmic space by teleportation. A person who needs to travel to Mars enters the teletransporter. The machine scans his or her body and records its data in the minutest detail, molecule by molecule, transmits the information at light speed to a similar station on Mars, and there, using organic materials identical to those on Earth and based on the information received, a kind of a 3D printer builds a replica of the person traveling to Mars. Although such scenarios prove to be very productive in science fiction, the idea of psychological continuity or the informational criterion has a huge problem: the problem of circularity. Already in the 18th century, Joseph Butler argued that memory, consciousness, and awareness of personal continuity presuppose personal continuity, and thus do not prove it. In order to be able to remember what happened 20 or 40 years ago, or be conscious that those things happened to me, I must be the same person. So the criterion requires personal continuity instead of demonstrating it. Only if I already am the same person can I remember something from my past. For remembering something means remembering myself doing that. Think again of the Brown-Robinson scenario. A slight modification will lead to completely different conclusions. Williams invites us to imagine that Robinson is healthy and is subjected to changes of consciousness by means of a machine. The machine wipes out Robinson's memories, reconfigurates his character, and generates completely different beliefs from those he had before, as if they were another person's. As a particular case, let us consider that Brown's mental life is implanted or uploaded to Robinson's brain. Who would leave the lab after this intervention, a Robinson or Brown? This time, the answer would be that Robinson is the survivor, with a peculiar mention that he has acquired some very strange beliefs about himself, claiming to be someone else, namely Brown. Although the end result of this experiment should be the same as the one imagined by Shoemaker, a Robinson who believes himself to be Brown, Williams argues that in this case the result is the opposite. This time we admit the continuity of Robinson's identity and the bodily criterion becomes dominant. Or think of the following situation. If I wake up tomorrow morning with a different personality, speaking Chinese and claiming that I live in Beijing, how would my wife respond? Would she think that I am another man and send me back to China? Or would she think that it is still me, but in need of urgent psychiatric treatment? The same conclusion can be reached when we think of hypnosis. One who has undergone changes of beliefs and character under hypnosis is not taken as a different person, but as one who has suffered a strange transformation. This means that the bodily criterion of personal identity cannot be dismissed. As we will see in further episodes on reincarnation, against such obvious absurdities, there are cases of little children who at a certain moment of their life start claiming to be a different person and are taken as proofs for reincarnation. Since we accept that personal identity is preserved even in cases of total psychological discontinuity, it seems that bodily continuity is essential for survival. In addition, we must realize the weakness of one of the premises on which the psychological criterion works. In all these thought experiments in which memory is transferred from one brain to another, the assumption is that memory is just information in the form of a file that is copied from one memory stick to another. But even from a physicalist point of view, this is difficult to hold, for we do not know if or how memory could be detached from the brain and stored in a computer. In this book, I discuss two other forms of the psychological criterion. One is formulated by Williams as the only X and Y principle, and the other is the best candidate theory by Robert Nozick. I also analyzed two other important physicalist perspectives, the one started by Derek Parfit as survival without numerical identity, and that of David Hume of considering the person as a mere collection of perceptions. To the horror of physicalist philosophers, a new path in the philosophy of mind was the return to a dualistic view of human nature, and to considering that the carrier of personal identity is the non-physical mind, or the soul. Thus, personal identity is not given by the body, brain, memory, or other psychological traits, because these are just indicators of personal identity, not its defining elements. Therefore, a theory emerged called the simple view. It affirms that personal identity is a concept that cannot be defined in physical terms because it is given by the non-physical mind. This perspective is also called non-reductionism, for we cannot reduce the human person to the body, brain, or psychological characteristics. The brain is the means by which the non-physical mind communicates with the physical world, and all observations made about the mental effects of brain injury are the result of affecting the connection of the mind with the body, which leads to limiting the capacity of the mind to communicate with the physical world. In other words, the close connection between physical events in the brain and mental events, the fact that mental illnesses are partially treatable with medication, or that drugs destroy the mind, does not prove that we have a purely physical nature, and still leaves open the possibility that the brain is only an instrument of the non-physical mind, or the soul. No matter how much neurological and psychiatric data we may have on the effects of physical injuries to mental capacities, we cannot conclude that mental events must have a strictly physical ground. The physical injuries of the brain show that there is a physical support of the respective mental functions, but they do not prove that mental phenomena are just another aspect of the physical. Following the simple vision, the relationship between the non-physical mind and the brain could be compared to the relationship between me and my laptop. If it were the only computer in the world through which I could express my thoughts, its role would be essential in writing, for instance, a book. Otherwise, it could not reach the publisher and readers. A malfunction of the computer, such as a failure of a key, would make my typing difficult, and its complete failure would stop it altogether. The computer remains an instrument, essential for writing, but only an instrument. My ideas would still exist without the computer, but I would not be able to share them. In a similar way, according to the simple view, the brain is just the instrument by which the mind can transmit its life. A neurological problem, say a broken key in the brain, would limit the mind's ability to communicate through this complex instrument called the brain. The error of physicalism would then be to attribute to the instrument, which is the brain, the role that belongs to the mind, and to study the brain in detail as a source of consciousness instead as an instrument of it. In an upcoming episode on the Christian view of human nature, we'll discuss how the soul can be seen as the form of the body, the entity that gives life to the body and also provides for consciousness and free will. For now, after considering some of the debates about the nature of personal identity and the criteria for preserving it, we see that we can scarcely define the core element of personal identity. This core element is the self. But what is the self? From a physicalist point of view, the self should be considered the body, or at least the most significant part of it, the brain, the carrier of mental life and consciousness. If the self has a physical nature, it disappears at death, and so does our personal identity. If we follow computationalist assumptions, the self is some kind of information stored in the brain, and personal identity could be preserved by downloading this information to another brain or to other hardware capable of keeping it functional. We'll see in an upcoming episode on transhumanism how such projects are desired to be put into practice. Surprisingly for a physicalist, John Searle came to the following definition of what the self is. We have to postulate a rational self or agent that is capable of acting freely and capable of assuming responsibility for actions. To be more precise, in order to account for free rational actions, we have to suppose there is a single entity X, such that X is conscious, with all that consciousness implies. X persists through time, X formulates and reflects on reasons for action under the constraints of rationality. X is capable of deciding, initiating, and carrying out actions under the presupposition of freedom, and already implicit in what I've said, X is responsible for at least some of its actions. However, Searle does not attempt to explain what the self is in practical, concrete terms, and does not solve the mystery of personal identity. Thomas Nagel, in his turn, admits that our true nature and the principle of our identity may be partly hidden from us, and that the methods needed to understand ourselves do not yet exist. After his own assessment of physicalist theories of personal identity, Colin McGinn concludes that none is sufficient because the self cannot be explained in reductionist terms. I quote, "The self is not the body, nor the brain, nor a construction from certain psychological relations." He finds plausible the view that the self is, I quote, "a simple indivisible substance that is not ontologically reducible to other sorts of entities and their relations, that its presence is all or nothing, that its survival can consist in nothing other than its identity over time, that its survival is not a matter of degree, since it is simple in nature, that it is a mental concept whose essence is best revealed from the first-person perspective. It is to be seen first and foremost as the reference of I." If we abandon the physicalist perspective and search for help in the Christian view of human nature, such an entity with such specification does exist. It is the soul, distinct from the body and irreducible to mental states. This is the topic of an upcoming episode on human nature. But before speaking of the Christian view, we must first exhaust the resources of physicalism in explaining human nature. In the next episode, we'll see to what extent artificial intelligence can help us to preserve consciousness, and whether someday artificial intelligence could become conscious. Don't forget to subscribe and share, for this information may be important for many others like you. God bless you.